North Africa, spring of 1942. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in his command post, studying the latest supply reports with growing frustration. Another convoy had failed to arrive. 27,000 tons of fuel and ammunition that should have been offloading in Tripoli was instead resting on the Mediterranean seafloor, along with the ships that carried it and the men who crewed them. This was not bad luck. This was something else entirely. The pattern had been unmistakable for months. Axis supply convoys would depart from Italian ports, their routes carefully planned, their schedules coordinated between German and Italian naval commands. And somehow, impossibly, British aircraft and submarines would be waiting at precisely the right coordinates at precisely the right time. Not searching, not patrolling, waiting. Rommel had commanded in North Africa since February of 1941. He understood logistics better than most generals. He knew that fuel determined everything in desert warfare, that ammunition expenditure could be calculated, that water consumption was predictable. He had planned his campaigns around these mathematical certainties. But now the mathematics had become impossible. His forces consumed supplies faster than they arrived. Not because he was wasteful, but because British forces were destroying his convoys with uncanny precision. In September of 1941, 38% of supplies shipped to North Africa had been sunk en route. In October, the figure climbed to 63%. These were not the random losses of war. These were surgical strikes based on perfect intelligence. Rommel wrote letter after letter to Berlin, his frustration evident in every line. The supply situation was catastrophic, he insisted. His forces were being strangled not by British military superiority in North Africa, but by British naval and air superiority in the Mediterranean. He needed more ships, more escorts, more reliable delivery. What he did not yet understand was that more ships would only mean more targets. 400 miles north of Rommel's headquarters, in a heavily guarded facility at Bletchley Park, England, British cryptanalysts were reading messages that Italian naval commanders believed to be perfectly secure. The Italians used a cipher machine called the C-38M for their naval communications. It was a sophisticated device, using rotors and electrical circuits to scramble messages into seemingly random letter combinations. The Italian Navy trusted it completely. They were wrong to do so. British cryptanalysts had broken the C-38M cipher in the summer of 1941. The breakthrough came from a combination of captured code materials, mathematical analysis, and the work of brilliant minds who understood that even the most complex cipher systems had weaknesses. Once broken, the C-38M became an open book. And the Italians, confident in their encryption, discussed everything over these supposedly secure channels. Convoy departure times, routes, speeds, escort compositions, cargo manifests, every detail that British forces needed to plan perfect intercepts. The system worked like this. Italian naval headquarters would transmit encrypted messages coordinating convoy movements. British listening stations would intercept these transmissions. The encrypted text would be sent to Bletchley Park, where cryptanalysts would decrypt it, usually within hours. The intelligence would then be forwarded to Royal Navy and Royal Air Force commands in the Mediterranean. Aircraft and submarines would be positioned along the convoy route, and Axis ships carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements would be sent to the bottom. The British called their code-breaking intelligence Ultra. It was among the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Winston Churchill received daily Ultra summaries. Only a handful of commanders in the field knew that such intelligence existed. The secret was so valuable that British commanders sometimes had to allow Axis convoys through unmolested, just to avoid creating patterns that might suggest code-breaking. But most convoys were not spared. On the night of November 8, 1941, a convoy of 7 ships departed from Naples bound for Tripoli. The ships carried 10,000 tons of fuel desperately needed for Rommel's planned operations. Italian Naval Command had transmitted the convoy's route and schedule using their C-38M cipher machines, confident the information was secure. British crypt analysts at Bletchley Park decrypted the messages within 3 hours of interception. By dawn, Royal Navy submarines and RAF torpedo bombers were moving into position along the convoy's route. By sunset, all 7 ships were sunk. Every drop of fuel, every ton of supplies, gone. Nearly 2,000 men drowned in the dark Mediterranean waters. Rommel learned of the loss 2 days later. He was preparing for Operation Crusader, the major British offensive that would begin on November 18th. His forces were already outnumbered. Now they would be outgunned as well, fighting with ammunition rationed and vehicles immobilized for lack of fuel. He wrote to his wife, Lucy, so on November 15th, "The supply situation is getting worse and worse. One cannot do anything about it from here. I can only wait and see whether the situation improves." It would not improve. It would get worse. The British offensive began 3 days later. Rommel's forces fought with characteristic skill and aggression, but they fought on empty tanks and with shrinking ammunition stocks. Vehicles were abandoned when they ran out of fuel. Artillery batteries rationed their shells. The Africa Corps demonstrated tactical brilliance but could not overcome logistical starvation. By December, Rommel had been forced to withdraw from Cyrenaica, abandoning hard-won territory. His forces fell back to defensive positions, their combat effectiveness degraded not by British tactical superiority, but by the simple absence of supplies. In his command post, Rommel studied maps and reports with growing suspicion. The pattern was too consistent, the British interceptions too precise. This was not random chance. This was not even good reconnaissance. This was something more. But what? German intelligence had its own success in North Africa. The American military attaché in Cairo, Colonel Bonner Fellers, sent detailed reports back to Washington about British positions, strengths, and intentions. These reports used a code that German cryptanalysts had broken. For months, Rommel received regular intelligence summaries based on Fellers' reports, giving him remarkable insight into British planning. This created a strange symmetry. Rommel knew what the British were planning to do in North Africa. The British knew what supplies Rommel would receive, or rather, what supplies he would not receive, because they intended to sink them. But Rommel did not know that the British knew. He believed his supply problems stemmed from British naval and air superiority, from Italian incompetence, from bad luck. He did not yet suspect the fundamental compromise of Axis communications security. In January of 1942, Rommel launched a surprise counter-offensive. His forces, despite their supply problems, drove the British back across Cyrenaica with stunning speed. The British had not expected the attack. Their ultra-intelligence had not warned them because Rommel's offensive orders had been transmitted using German Enigma codes, which were more secure than the Italian naval codes, and which British cryptanalysts had more difficulty reading in real time. The success was intoxicating, but brief. By February, Rommel's forces had again outrun their supply lines. And again, the convoys bringing fuel and ammunition were being sunk with disturbing regularity. On March 26, 1942, a large convoy departed from Italy, 5 ships carrying crucial supplies for Rommel's next planned offensive. British ultra-intelligence provided complete details. RAF aircraft found the convoy exactly where the decrypted messages said it would be. 4 of the 5 ships were sunk. Rommel's chief of staff, General Alfred Gauss, noted in the Africa Corps War Diary that the supply situation had become desperate. The entry questioned how British forces could locate convoys so consistently. The question hung in the air, unanswered but increasingly urgent. By May of 1942, Rommel was planning his most ambitious operation yet, an offensive to capture Tobruk and drive into Egypt. He needed supplies for this operation on a massive scale, fuel for his tanks and vehicles, ammunition for his artillery, food and water for his men, medical supplies for the inevitable casualties. The convoys came. Some made it through. Many did not. Between January and May of 1942, 44% of supplies shipped to North Africa were sunk en route. The percentage varied month to month based on British operational priorities and weather conditions, but the underlying cause remained constant. British cryptanalysts were reading Italian naval communications in near real time. Rommel launched his offensive on May 26th. His forces fought brilliantly, demonstrating the tactical excellence that had made him legendary. They outmaneuvered British forces, captured Tobruk on June 21st, and drove deep into Egypt. By the end of June, Rommel's forces were at El Alamein, only 60 miles from Alexandria, threatening the entire British position in Egypt. But they were at the end of an impossibly long supply line, operating on fumes and rationed ammunition. In his command post near El Alamein, Rommel confronted the mathematical impossibility of his situation. His forces had advanced 700 miles from their main supply base at Tripoli. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every can of food had to be trucked across that distance. And the fuel to run the trucks consumed fuel. And the trucks themselves broke down in the desert heat and had to be abandoned or repaired with scarce parts. And still, the supply ships kept sinking. Rommel wrote to Lucy on July 3rd. Things are, unfortunately, not going as well as I should like. Resistance is too great and our strength exhausted. He was 50 miles from Alexandria. 50 miles from a victory that could change the entire strategic balance in the Mediterranean. But he might as well have been 500 miles away. His tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. His artillery conserved ammunition. His men ate reduced rations. The British, reading his supply situation through ultra-intelligence, knew he was vulnerable. They knew he could not sustain offensive operations. They knew his forces were stronger in reputation than in actual combat power. In August, General Bernard Montgomery took command of British forces in Egypt. He received regular ultra-intelligence summaries. He knew Rommel's supply situation in detail. He knew when convoys were scheduled, which ones would arrive, which ones British forces would intercept. He could plan his defensive preparations with confidence, knowing Rommel lacked the resources for sustained offensive action. On the night of August 30th, Rommel launched what would be his final offensive in North Africa. His forces attacked at Alam Halfa, attempting to outflank British positions. Montgomery, forewarned by ultra-intelligence about Rommel's fuel shortage, positioned his forces to force Rommel into a long approach march that would consume his limited fuel supplies. The battle lasted 6 days. Rommel's forces, unable to sustain the offensive without fuel, withdrew. After Alam Halfa, Rommel wrote in his diary that the British seemed to know his every move, to anticipate his every decision. The sense of fighting against an enemy with supernatural knowledge gnawed at him. But he still did not understand the source. In September of 1942, a German signals intelligence unit in North Africa made a disturbing discovery. The unit, commanded by Captain Alfred Seebohm, had been intercepting and analyzing British radio communications. Seebohm's analysts noticed something strange. British forces sometimes reacted to German plans before those plans could reasonably have been discovered through normal reconnaissance. Seebohm prepared a report suggesting that Axis communications might be compromised. The report was forwarded to Rommel's headquarters. It arrived in late September. Rommel read it carefully. The implications were staggering. If Axis codes were broken, if British intelligence could read German and Italian communications, then everything made sense. The supply convoy interceptions, the British anticipation of his movements, the uncanny positioning of their forces. But which codes were compromised? The German Enigma system, the Italian ciphers, both? And if the codes were broken, when had it happened? How long had the British been reading Axis communications? Rommel ordered an immediate review of communications security. Italian naval codes came under particular scrutiny. The pattern of convoy losses suggested that convoy routing information was being intercepted and read. But the Italians insisted their C-38M cipher machines were secure. The Germans had their own doubts about Italian security, but lacked concrete proof. In October, Rommel returned to Germany for medical treatment and meetings with Hitler. He brought his concerns about communication security with him. He met with intelligence officials. He reviewed the evidence, the pattern of convoy losses, the British ability to position forces perfectly, the mounting circumstantial evidence of code breaking. But circumstantial evidence was not proof. And even if codes were compromised, changing entire communication systems during active operations was enormously difficult. New codes had to be distributed, new procedures implemented, operators trained, all while fighting a war. The bureaucratic inertia was massive. Italian naval commanders resisted suggestions that their codes were broken. They had faith in their cipher machines. They attributed convoy losses to British naval superiority, to bad luck, to anything except the possibility that their most secret communications were being read by the enemy. While Rommel was in Germany, Montgomery prepared his offensive at El Alamein. He had time to prepare because ultra-intelligence told him Rommel's forces lacked the supplies to attack first. He had confidence in his planning because ultra-intelligence gave him detailed information about Axis positions, strengths, and supply situations. The Second Battle of El Alamein began on October 23, 1942. Rommel was still in Germany. He flew back immediately, arriving on October 25th to find his forces under massive assault. The battle lasted 12 days. Rommel's forces fought with desperate skill, but they fought without adequate supplies. Fuel shortages limited maneuver, ammunition shortages forced rationing. The Africa Corps demonstrated that tactical excellence could not overcome material insufficiency. On November 4th, Rommel ordered a retreat. His forces fell back across Libya, abandoning the territory they had held for months. The withdrawal continued through November and December, all the way back to Tunisia. During the retreat on July 10, 1942, Seybom's signals intelligence unit was overrun and captured by British forces at Tel El Aissa. Seybom himself was killed. His documents, his equipment, his trained personnel, all captured. The British now had direct evidence of how much German signals intelligence knew about British communications, and they had confirmation that Seybom had suspected Axis codes were compromised. But by then, the damage was done. Rommel's supply situation had been systematically destroyed by British code breaking for more than a year. The Africa Corps had fought brilliantly, but had been strangled by logistics. In his papers and letters from late 1942 and early 1943, Rommel's tone shifted. He wrote less about tactical problems and more about intelligence concerns. He questioned how British forces could have such perfect information. He noted that the supply situation, always difficult, had been made impossible by losses that seemed too consistent to be chance. In December of 1942, some Italian naval codes were finally changed. The C-38M cipher machines were gradually replaced with more secure systems. But the change came too late. The decisive period of the North African campaign was over. Rommel's forces were in retreat. Allied forces were landing in Morocco and Algeria, opening a second front. The strategic situation was irreversible. Rommel would later write in his papers, edited and published after his death, about the supply crisis that had crippled his operations. He noted the suspicious consistency of convoy losses. He described the frustration of planning operations around supplies that never arrived. He questioned whether intelligence failures had contributed to his defeat, but he never wrote a single definitive statement. On this date, I realized the British had broken our codes. There was no dramatic moment of revelation, no single instance where the truth became undeniable. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of evidence, a growing suspicion, a mounting certainty that something fundamental had been compromised. The truth emerged in pieces: Sabome's suspicions, the pattern of losses, the British anticipation of German moves, the circumstantial evidence that accumulated month after month until denial became impossible. By early 1943, Rommel knew, not from a single revelation, but from the weight of accumulated evidence. The British had been reading Axis communications. The supply convoys had been sunk because British intelligence knew exactly when and where they would be. His operations had been anticipated because his plans had been compromised. The realization was bitter. He had fought brilliantly. His forces had demonstrated tactical superiority repeatedly. They had won battles against superior numbers. They had executed maneuvers that military historians would study for decades, and they had lost anyway because the enemy could read their mail. In his final months in North Africa, before being recalled to Europe in March of 1943, Rommel operated with the knowledge that his communications were compromised. He limited radio traffic. He used couriers for sensitive information. He attempted to maintain operational security in an environment where security had been fundamentally breached. But these measures, like the code changes, came too late. The decisive period had passed. The Africa Corps had been defeated not by inferior generalship or poor tactics, but by an intelligence advantage that had systematically destroyed their logistics for more than a year. The British kept ultra secret throughout the war and for decades afterward. Rommel died in October of 1944, forced to commit suicide after being implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler. He went to his death knowing that his supply lines had been compromised, but perhaps not knowing the full extent of British code-breaking capabilities. The complete story of Ultra was not revealed until the 1970s, when British official secrets were finally declassified. Only then did historians understand the full scope of British code-breaking operations. Only then could they calculate the precise impact on Rommel's operations. The numbers were devastating. In the critical period, between June of 1941 and October of 1942, British forces sank or damaged hundreds of Axis supply ships in the Mediterranean. Hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment ended up on the seafloor instead of in Rommel's supply dumps. The Africa Corps fought the entire campaign on a fraction of the supplies that had been shipped for them. Historians later calculated that if even half the sunk supplies had reached Rommel, the North African campaign might have ended differently. With adequate fuel, his tanks could have maintained offensive momentum. With adequate ammunition, his artillery could have provided sustained fire support. With adequate supplies, his forces could have consolidated their gains instead of constantly retreating due to logistics. But history does not run on hypotheticals. It runs on what actually happened. And what actually happened was that British cryptanalysts broke Italian naval codes. British intelligence read Axis supply communications, and British forces systematically destroyed Rommel's logistics. Rommel realized this gradually and bitterly through the accumulated evidence of impossible losses and uncanny British knowledge. There was no single moment of revelation. There was only the slow, grinding certainty that he was fighting a war where the enemy knew his secrets. He never said exactly when he knew. He never recorded the precise moment of realization. But his papers and letters from late 1942 onward show a man who understood that he had been fighting at a fundamental disadvantage, that tactical brilliance could not overcome strategic intelligence failure, that the Africa Corps had been defeated as much by British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park as by British soldiers in the desert. What did Rommel say when he realized Britain had broken his supply codes? He said it in fragments, in letters to his wife about impossible supply situations, in diary entries, questioning British foreknowledge, in operational reports noting suspicious patterns, in conversations with staff officers about communications security. He said it in the bitterness of retreat, in the frustration of fighting without adequate supplies, in the knowledge that his forces had fought brilliantly and lost anyway. He said it in the recognition that modern warfare was fought not just with tanks and artillery, but with mathematics and intelligence, with cipher machines and cryptanalysts, with secrets kept and secrets stolen. And he said it in the final understanding that in this new kind of warfare, the side that could read the enemy's communications held an advantage that tactical skill could not overcome. The Desert Fox had been outfoxed, not by a better general, but by a better secret.